let them vote against us. We'll save a lot.
Poland's president signs into law controversial judicial reforms despite a threat from the EU to suspend his country's voting rights. Angry scenes at Uganda's parliament, opposition members suspended as a vote goes through to scrap presidential age limits.
And I'm Peter Stimmet in Doha with all the day's sports news as Russia's ban from Paralympic sport is upheld, but they do have another month to prove their athletes should be allowed to compete in Pyeongchang.
So we begin in the United States, where President Donald Trump is celebrating his legislative victory, which will allow for the biggest overhaul of the U.S. tax system in 30 years. Earlier, the U.S. House of Representatives gave the $1.5 trillion tax reform bill its final approval. It will now pass to President Trump to be signed into law. Republicans have praised the bill, which will repeal parts of Obamacare, but a recent poll suggested 55% of Americans oppose it. Well, the bill slashes the corporate tax rate from 35 to 21% as of January the 1st and ends tax advantages for companies that move overseas. Income tax rates and inheritance tax will be reduced for most people. Those earning over $500,000 a year will experience higher tax reductions, but these provisions are only temporary, ending in 2026. The bill is expected to add $1.5 trillion to the US national debt over the next decade. Currently stands at $20 trillion. Our White House correspondent Kimberly Halka joins me now live from Washington, D.C. Hi there, Kimberly. So there were a lot of self-satisfied faces, I think it's fair to say, on the White House lawn earlier. Is this the triumph for Trump that he hopes it is?
Well, I guess the proof will be whether or not Americans really see those tax savings that they're promised in the new year. Certainly, right now, all that ordinary Americans have are promises that they hope will materialize. And right now, that is what is being touted as Donald Trump has really celebrated his first legislative victory on the South Lawn of the White House with Republicans by his side, both members of Congress in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. The Democrats, for their part, say this is the worst thing that could have happened to middle-class Americans because there's really very little trust that corporate America, with these big tax breaks, will really trickle down those savings to ordinary Americans. At the same time, Donald Trump and Republicans say that what this is going to do with the cut to corporate tax rates, it's going to make America more competitive. It's going to bring jobs that went overseas back to the United States and put more money in Americans' wallets.
It's been an amazing experience, I have to tell you. Hasn't been done in 34 years, but actually really hasn't been done because we broke every record. It's the largest, I always say the most massive, but it's the largest tax cut in the history of our country, and reform, but tax cut. Really something special.
So, Kimberly, what's been the reaction then of the American public? Are they just going to suck this one and see and just wait and see if all of these things materialize?
Right. It may not be until February before Americans see these tax promises materialize, according to the White House. So, given that there's already deep distrust of government in the United States, a lot of people feeling like they'll believe it when they see it, if you will. Most Americans, according to the polls that have been put out in recent days, seem to indicate that 2/3 don't believe this is going to have any big impact on their life. That could have a lot to do with the fact that this legislation was hastily written and rewritten. Even some members of Congress didn't read all 500 pages. So there's room for skepticism given those facts out in the public. At the end of the day, though, this isn't even signed into law. While the president is celebrating this legislative victory, it still has to be signed into law. The president's saying it would have been done by the end of the year, but now due to some sort of legal wrangling and need for legal review, it looks like that it will actually happen in the new year now, potentially. And again, those tax savings that Americans have been promised, well, now they're hearing those won't be in January as they'd hoped, but instead in February.
Kimberly Halka there live from the White House. Kimberly, thank you. Well, Republicans call the tax bill entitlement reform, but it will see cuts to social welfare programs like Medicare that could impact millions. Some reports suggest Medicare could be cut by $25 billion next year. Andy Gallagher reports now from Florida.
You are contestant number 3.
The Bay Oaks retirement home in Miami has been housing the elderly for 70 years. Many of its residents rely on social welfare programs and have for decades. Some, like 87-year-old Janet Lightbecker, are paying close attention to what's happening in Washington. A former social worker, Janet, says welfare may be coming to an end.
My generation, I think we never thought of Social Security having an end date, but I believe it will. Perhaps it'll be 2025, 2030, but there will come an end. But this is plenty of time for everybody to get their act together. But in the meantime, it's it's sad.
I-19. Of particular concern are potential changes to Medicare, a federal program for over 65s. It could face cuts of up to $25 billion. When Medicare and Medicaid were set up in the 1960s, it encompassed the idea of a greater society, one that took care of its poor and elderly. Experts say any cuts to those programs won't necessarily mean less money for recipients, but it will mean less cash for doctors, hospitals, and nursing facilities. And advocates say that could have terrible consequences.
This was going to be terrible. My clinic represents...
Donnell Newman says without access to affordable health care, millions could suffer.
Doctors who take care of elderly patients will find themselves unable to accept patients. They will turn people away who need the care most of all and who can't afford to pay high private market rates or premiums.
More than 50 million Americans currently receive Medicare benefits, and with a rapidly aging population, it's seen by many as a vital safety net.
It's a curious thing. 10,000 people turn 65 every day in America and will for the next 20 years. So I imagine the majority of those people vote, and I imagine that when the cuts actually take place, they'll be adversely affected and they're going to go to the polls.
The conference report is adopted without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
The Republicans' tax reform bill is already unpopular among many voters. It's hoped with next year's midterm elections approaching, drastic cuts may be avoided. Andy Gallagher, Aljazeera, Miami, Florida.
Well, staying with President Trump, and he's threatened to cut off financial aid to countries that vote in favour of a draft United Nations resolution against his decision to recognise Jerusalem as Israel's capital. The 193-member UN General Assembly will hold a rare emergency special session on Thursday at the request of Arab and Muslim countries. Mike Hanna has more now from the United Nations.
Security Council staff pose with the Secretary-General for an annual photograph. Then it's business as usual in the chamber. Like most other member states, those represented here unwilling to comment publicly on the extraordinary letter sent by U.S. Ambassador Nikki Haley.
Ambassador, did you receive the letter from Nikki Haley about